Books make you hope. Books make you dream. Books make you laugh. Books make you scream. This is the Books That Make You show, discussing books with authors and experts, unraveling the inner pages of all the books that help make us who we are.
Welcome, everybody. It is the Books That Make You show, and I am your host, Desiree Duffy. And we're talking about books that make you enter a dark fantasy world filled with villains that you love to hate and power politics that draw satirical parallels with the real world. All this from a surprising new author with the Amber Menhir, the first book in the Shadows of the Monolith series. Jonathan N. Pruitt is a lifelong educator turned fantasy author, and his real life redemption arc took him from being a child prodigy in let's say an economically disadvantaged rural county in Florida to obtaining his PhD at the age of 24, OMG, and then on to an international scandal in 2020 that attacked his research methods. But like the phoenix, he rises. Jonathan has taught and traveled around the world. He's an enigmatic ball of energy, and he's going to bring some humor, I imagine, biting human insights, and the perspective of a scientist, as well as the creative spirit of an inventor to this Books That Make You interview. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am looking forward to this. Okay. Start with the big picture. What is going on with the Amber Menhir? And maybe tell us what a menhir is, too.
Yeah, well, okay, so let's start off with what menhirs are in real life. So menhirs in real life are standing stones, so cut stones that are set up on their side that oftentimes have a mysterious origin. They're fairly common in Western Europe, and so you can think of them as like an obelisk from like an ancient and bygone era. And oftentimes the technologies used to erect them and cut them are mysterious. And the topic of I've already said mystery. So I wanted to say from my world, I was like, I wanted to create these. What are menhirs in my world? Menhirs are towering institutions of magical learning and research that educate each and every generation of incoming magic user, in my world, thaumaturges, and also help to research new kinds of magics that might be able to save humanity and indeed all of life from a forthcoming cosmic agent known as calamity that the world, an unnamed world in this instance, will intercept in the next few thousand years and could kill all life if the menhirs don't save all of humanity. So they're sort of research and educational institutions of magic in my world, and they're also they cast great shadows across the land.
You've got a lot of undercurrents there, a lot of dual meanings, and you're reflecting the real world because in a lot of ways that sounds similar to what we have in real life. Do you want to talk about how you're holding up that mirror in your writing?
Well, it's to be clear, it's a funhouse mirror. It is intentionally warped and deliberate and tongue-in-cheek, and like everything's taken up to the 11th degree. So like, these menhirs are populated by evil scholars that are almost twirling their mustaches and sing-songing their way through their lines while they say things that are so disingenuous. But it is meant to be a bit of a satire of real life, but to be a joke that we can all laugh at. It is not meant to be cutting it, I think, at least too deep.
Okay, so you kind of keep things on the surface, but there's those undertones there that people. Yeah, I get it.
I could be. I'm winking at a diversity of entities in the end.
I hear you. And okay. We've got so much to go into here, and I'm not twirling my mustache because I do not have one, but I'm doing weird things with my hands. For those of you who are watching, can we talk about the villains and what your characters and why, for example, why do you say that we are all a villain in someone's life? And if you don't think you are, you're being naive. Can we talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think if you end up standing for anything in your life, if you have any principles or if you advocate for anything, in society, there's always somebody else who opposes you, who has an alternative view. And some people just deliberately take the opposing side and begin to identify with it. So I think if you stand for anything at some point or another, you're going to be the villain, at least in a micro or mesocosm, over some issue in somebody else's view. And it might be something so frivolous as you are an advocate for a different football team or soccer team, and you're wearing a different colored jersey. Well, that day on the field, you are the enemy, and you winning that outcome, your ideal scenario, is what I do not want to have happen. And so anytime that views can become opposing, people can sort of villainize you in that instance. And I deliberately select characters that come from different sides of the, critical conflicts that sculpt my fictitious world, so that you can see even these things that appear at face value to be cut and dry. The Menhirs do something that's questionable. Actually, it's not necessarily clear. From the perspective of another character, you can see that the Menhirs are upstanding and have been founded on good reason and are actually doing something of great value in the long term. And so I try to create a world of grays. And I think that's because, I myself have been argued to be somewhat gray. And I can find the characters that lurk in that interstitial space between good and evil to be the most intriguing and endearing. I think that's why anti-heroes are endearing.
Absolutely. And let's face it, there are a lot of folks who want to see things in very polar ends of spectrums, but everything is lying somewhere in the middle. You're so right that, everybody comes at a position, a theme, an idea, a philosophy with a different perspective. And a lot of times it depends upon your upbringing, your socioeconomic status, how you were taught, how you were raised. So let's backtrack, because you said something about the microcosm of your world. So can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Well, let's see. So in the first book, I'm going to put this in the context of world building and then character construction. I'll start with world building, and then maybe I'll drift a little bit into character construction and how it's related to that. And, as a fantasy author, there's a lot of attention paid, I think correctly, to world building and world building practices and making sure you have a fleshed out view. But you can spend your whole life developing that world and writing an encyclopedia of that world. And there are worksheets and groups online, et cetera, that will advocate for that practice. But, when you're writing a book or a short story or a film or anything, I think that the story has to be first and foremost about some characters and where they fit into that world. And I think, okay, you identify who your character's going to be, you identify where they fit in that world. And I think at that level, it's important to engage in enough world building that you know where the critical conflicts that are going to motivate your characters and motivate your world are clear. But I would hold off on conveying every single detail about your world until you're pretty well developed and your reader is invested in the characters. I'd rather go lean on world building. So I oftentimes say, I prefer a microcosm of world building to begin with. I don't tell you about the whole continent of my world. I don't talk to you about the 5 Menhirs and the history for the last 3,000 years. I'd rather start off with a little village, one character, a pair of characters, one of the Menhirs, and start by creating that world and making sure that you have a sense of it before I basically waterboard you with a bunch of encyclopedic information that you don't have any context for yet. And if you're one of the first few readers reading this, if you memorized all my natural history and the evolutionary ecology of these weird lizards and these lice on this other population over here, and the detailed history of X, Y, and Z, that's lovely, but unless there's a storyline about characters that people care about, you're going to be one of the only people who knows anything about that world. So I want to draw people in with characters and then slowly give them the details of a sumptuous world that can give them a more fulfilled and rounded and realistic view. But I say, world building is a bit like, if you get in too far, it could be like La Brea tar pits, and suddenly you've lost a bunch of your readers and you've alienated them before you've had a chance to lure them in.
Yeah, because we relate to people, characters, conflict, their struggles, their questions. That setting is lush and intriguing and inviting. But yeah, you don't want to go walking into the La Brea tar pits. You sink down and you're hanging out with the smilodons and the mammoths and whatever else down there. That's not a good place.
Yeah, a lot of extinct animals that, I'm not sure that there'd be sumptuous company.
Right, right. Authors there 20 years later going, look, I created my world.
Yeah.
And getting the story down like you have done oh so well is so important. I want to hang with the world building stuff just a little bit more because you use this amalgamated biology technique in creating your organisms. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I probably spent, I don't know, 18 or 19 years of my life studying the biology of weird organisms in remote locales all over the world. And I've been very lucky to be able to enjoy those experiences. And so when I was creating my world, I thought, okay, like, you're not, I mean, I'm not going to tell you about all the different organisms in my fantasy world, but the ones that I show you, I want to make sure that they're as fascinating as they can be. So I sort of suture together all of these neat natural history and behavioral and physiological elements of different organisms that I find most fascinating, and then stitch them together and let you see like this showcase of an organism that features the social structure of a vampire bat and the milk creating physiology of a monotrum, like a duck milk platypus or an echidna, and then features it's like cow sized, and then has the communication system of a capybara. And if you know what you're looking at, you realize I've sutured together the cool biology of a bunch of different animals that could each inspire, nature documentaries on their own. And I've put it in one juggernaut and been like, look at this neat organism. Oh, and they're sequential hermaphrodites, needless to say. So my organisms are not for the faint of heart.
I love it. I love it. Now, you say utopias and dystopias are the same thing?
Yeah. Remember back when I said you're going to be the enemy of somebody? Well, like society, as long as everyone's agreeing in society, like there are general goals that most people in society will agree are good for humanity, for the earth, et cetera, et cetera. And so society will move along some number of lines until we reach to a moment in time where our interests are misaligned. And so society will descend on these small number of critical issues, whatever happens to bifurcate the population in more or less 50-50 sorts of percentages. And then when that forms, and ideologies and identities form with those in accordance with those views. If your side wins in that disagreement, you might think that brings you closer to your utopia, your ideal world. But for another big chunk of the population, your ideal is almost certainly not ideal. Go ask 20 of your closest friends in secret, like, what's your idea of heaven? What would that look like? And then try to, like poker face, not like me, I give it all away. Poker face, write it all down, and then reflect later on, like, which of these would be a living hell for you? And I bet you a bunch of them. Like so one of my friends might say something like, "Oh, a big giant barbecue buffet where I never get full and never get fat. Sounds wonderful." You know what? After 3 days of eating barbecue, I'll tell you, I don't feel so great.
Right.
Anyway, so yeah, utopias and dystopias. For every notion of a utopia, there's another kind of person who has opposing views to you, or has dissimilar experiences, or comes from a different perspective, who would view that as hellacious if it were fixed. And so be careful when you think that when you wield subjective power and you wield power over a situation, and you think you're designing an ideal set of circumstances, that if you don't consider other views, if you don't consider other people, you're very likely creating a set of circumstances that's going to be dangerous and uncomfortable for another kind of person that you might not be considering.
So humanity is doomed because we'll never be able to make all people happy, and you're.
Does that mean you're doomed? I don't think we're going to make everybody happy all the time, but does that mean that we're doomed? I'm like, I don't know. That's 0 to 60. I feel like if generally, most people are trying to do the right thing. Most people are trying to make the world a better place, and I think that humanity has a pretty good track record over the long term of making the world more peaceful and verdant and put together. We can lament about how our own society, or my dystopian society, we lament about the current circumstances, but oftentimes, if you look back, at least through our history, you go back to the age of the Golden Horn, like, oh my God, people were insane, like drinking out of each other's skulls and stuff. Like, actually, we're doing pretty good these days. Like, go back 300 years and be like, socially advanced people were saying things that right now we would be viewed as gibberingly racist and insensitive. The moral zeitgeist and our sense of humanity, and extending that humanity beyond humans, like animals, etc., and nature and Earth more broadly, is progressing all the time. And I take pride in that as a participant in a process that's improving, I think, the world through time. I don't think that we're going backwards, at least at a macro level.
Okay. And I tease a little bit because I'm teasing. But I do appreciate the fact that you bring a sense of humor, a little bit of irony, and you make it realistic, because it does seem like some people can be very Pollyanna in the way they look at the world, and some people can be very nihilistic. And there's a realism that lies somewhere in between, I think, and I'll let you explain more, when you talk about traveling the world and the places that you've lived, from deserts to jungles. You've been given the opportunity to see things from many different perspectives. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I have to confess, a portion of that was just distorted. I freely admit. However, what I think you said was that maybe that people are Pollyannas, and can you rephrase that word just quickly for me?
Sure. No. I'm just weaving it back into, you have traveled. You've done a lot of traveling,
Sure.
and you're a scientist. You're a teacher, and doing some of that traveling. You've lived in places, desert areas, jungle areas. From what I understand, you've often had a book in tow with you. And I'm just saying that it seems that has informed a lot of your writing too. And maybe tell us a little bit about some of your travels.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's writing is a tale of bips and bobs, and so like everybody is stitching together all of their experiences all the time. And so, I have been lucky enough to spend a big chunk of my life in the wild that is left in the world, some of the least populated places on Earth, like the Namib or Kalahari deserts in South Africa or Namibia or rainforests, etc. And those can be very isolating places. It sounds really romantic, like I'm going to go live in a rainforest for 6 months, and turns out that can be pretty isolating. And so books have been with me as my constant companions. And if you only have so many Audible credits and you're going to be there for a long time, you could do a lot worse than epic fantasy to make sure that you have something to entertain yourself, or to have a book in hand the teeny tiny print that you can read when the power is out, because there's a rolling brownout that's going to last for the next 3 days. And so you end up reading in a hammock or beneath a tree that's raining, but urticating hairs on you. But books have been my companions all over the world, and those characters that were within them have probably kept me sane to whatever degree I am sane through those experiences. And like Robert Jordan, Wheel of Time, or George R. Martin's Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire. Those are the epic tales. The Dune series, all of those epic tales filled me up, kept me intrigued, kept me focused on something. And so I feel like a lot of those characters have been more consistent companions for me than any individual real person in flesh and blood could ever have been. And a lot of those worlds directly inform the writing of and the creation of my fantasies and my characters. And so I remember those key moments, those key phrases, those key interactions, or those moments in a battle that mattered most to me, that were the most impactful, that stood out among thousands and thousands of pages. And then I tried to craft the fantasy of my fantasies and make sure that I try to populate my book with as many of those moments and the lead ups that made them significant that I possibly can, to give readers at least the kind of experiences that brought me back time and again to these fantasy worlds. Because it's escapism when you need it, but then also there's something that keeps bringing you back. And for me, I could identify what those things were, and I wanted to bring those into my world as well.
Yeah, I think, Jonathan, you just described every reader's fantasy in and of itself. Reading in the jungle in a hammock during a brownout? Bring it, right? That sounds perfect.
Yeah, imagine though it's 93 degrees as well, and it's kind of mizzling the entire time, and it's and you do smell bad. Like even the notion of deodorant. I mean, I guess I could put on deodorant just to feel like I did something, but then 2 minutes later, there will be very little evidence that you were wearing deodorant.
Yeah,
it's a gorgeous landscape, and I'm totally lucky, and I'm glad I got to do it. Careful what you wish for.
Very true. Very true. So, can we get into this life you once led and how that bridges to the new one that you have as a fantasy writer?
Yeah. I was engulfed in this giant controversy, and for a long time, I wasn't able to do anything. And as a scientist, scientists are first and foremost storytellers. After they've run their experiments, they've mulled over the data, and they figure out what that kind of means and what it doesn't mean. They have to place it in the context and the narrative of pre-existing studies and what it could mean for the future, and what it could mean for life in general, or physics, or chemistry, or geology, or whatever. And they have to do that in a way that draws other scientists in and the public, and they have to be able to communicate. They are social storytelling chameleons by instinct. And so when I really liked that. And so when I was all bottled up and I couldn't do anything, and the veracity of anything I said could be drawn into question, I thought, what am I going to do? I have all these skills, all these drives, all these loves of storytelling, and I might not ever be able to do any of that again. And that was a horrific moment. And then, then I looked over at my nightstand and I thought, there's a book there. And and this is a fantasy book. And if people doubt what you say, then why not engage in a kind of storytelling where, like, the very idea is that you're saying something that isn't true to the letter. And so I was like, okay, maybe this is an avenue out. And I imagined in my mind's eye that, like, oh, okay, I'm going to do that in my 40s or my 50s or some other time, assuming I lived to that stage. And like, ooh, who knows? I have a spicy past. But I thought, like, I'm going to try this. I might be doing it a little bit at gunpoint. I might be doing it a little bit earlier than I thought, but I'm going to try this out. And it turned out to be very therapeutic, and I got to sort of pour out my love of writing and my love of reading, and be both a consumer and a producer of these imaginary worlds, and it gave me a new sense of identity and allowed me to channel a lot of my energy into something that felt good, felt unadulterated. And at the end, although it only occurred at the very end, I was able to produce something I was proud of. And I thought, like, when I read my book now, I always, when I start reading my book, I think to myself, oh my God, this is going to be so scary. And it's going to be so stressful. Maybe I'm going to see a bunch of mistakes. But at the time I finished my book, I'm like, man, that's a good book. I'm like, that came out of me. Anyway, so I don't want to say that it saved me, but it might have saved aspects of me. And so I'm very thankful for that. Does that answer your question?
That's beautiful. Well, what you're saying, Jonathan, is something that I do hear from a lot of writers. Trust me, I talk to them a lot of them on the show. And in your writing, okay, we'll have fun with it. You're God in your writing. You built a world. You've created people. I know. I mean, don't say that. That sounds so sacrilege, but that ability to have sovereignty and control, especially if the world around you is something where you might feel you've lost control, that can be therapeutic and can be good. And then when you can unleash that world in the form of your book to the masses, that is just got to be an incredible feeling as well. I mean, what do you think with your book? And this is part of a series. How does it feel, Jonathan?
Well, I'll tell you, first and foremost, frightening. Very frightening. And and I'm a pretty brave person. I like, I have a pretty thick skin. I can put myself out there, but this is my first book that is coming out, and so I don't have a track record. I don't know what readers will like or what they won't like, and will my book be able to find the people who will love it, and will there be people who love it, or does everyone just pan it? But up until this moment, it's mostly an act in isolation. So you'd write these hundreds of pages or thousands of pages, and I've drafted 3 of these books in the series, and when somebody asks, what did you do today? And you're like, well, I worked on chapter 17 in the 3rd volume of a fantasy series that, a dozen people have read. And so you look at them and you say, I did some writing, and you can't really share with them. Like, I'm trying to untie this plot knot and I'm worried that I can't get out of it. So, it's isolating, but I think that isolation isn't going to be there any longer. If there were a dozen interested readers during the process of writing this book, I think it would not have been isolating at all. It would have been a much easier practice. I hope that I think it's true, that once I have even a small number of readers that take interest in this world and want to see the conclusion of this story, it's going to be euphoric from there to the end, I think. At least, I think the doldrums, the lows, and the deers won't be quite as deep, knowing that there are teammates. And I think of readers as being teammates, and it's as much their world as mine as soon as we release it. I think it will be more fun and more dynamic, and the highs will be higher, and the lows hopefully won't be as low. But I'm also afraid, right? So, a lot of it's trumped up fear, like, maybe I'm not going to get any readers, or maybe no one's going to like it, and maybe this and the other. Maybe you're just some sort of like strange idiopathic anomaly that just likes a particular kind of fantasy that no one else will like. But I don't think that's realistic in another portion of my brain, and so I just have to be patient and see who likes it and who doesn't like it, and and then for the people who like it, keep writing for them, give them what they love, and let that relationship between writer and reader flourish.
Exactly. And from what I've heard other readers say, they love it. So I don't think you have too much to be afraid of. I want to ask you about the dedication in your book. Yeah. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah. So to loss, I think I said, I think the phrase is to loss a stern but very gifted teacher. In a lot of ways, I saw who I identified as a person, and my psychology likes to curl around my job very, to a high degree. Like, I am my job, I am scientist, I am writer, I am whatever that I'm teacher. So my psychology clings a hold of Arbeiten very tightly, and so when I saw that imperiled, I thought, my identity's gone. It's burning. At the same time, I don't want to get into the weeds too much about this, but my closest relatives were also passing away. They were ill, very sick, and so they were also vanishing, and so I was losing all this stuff, and but very little of it was wasted. I think the phrase that, and maybe I'll botch this phrase, but it's a phrase I thought about while mall walking yesterday or something. Which is just hilarious to say out loud. What is a forest burned but a blank canvas, and one that's fertilized? So, I saw one version of myself destroyed, compromised, but not all of it was compromised. And even the act of loss itself, I think, gave some of the things like my characters more depth. The fact that I was getting closer to relatives whom I had estranged relationships with until they needed me very badly at the end, and then suddenly I'm a much better caregiver than a receiver of care. So our relationship improved when they needed things from me, and so I think that my characters have a greater softness for each other and a greater fondness, and are more broken and relatable. I think because of that, because I was losing a lot, and now that I've sort of passed through most of that. And then there's a new version of me on the horizon, and hopefully will not glom a hold of writer quite so tightly as I did the last affair. But now that I'm seeing sprouts in the forest, they're easier to appreciate, and I find them more lovely. And in a very sort of existentialist way, maybe even the destruction of the forest was a good thing for me. If I wasn't rendered so uncomfortable, perhaps I would have never acted. And I think I might be a better writer of fantasy than I was a scientist. And I thought I was a pretty good scientist. We'll see.
Yeah. You remind me of a Renaissance person, if I may say that. Somebody who has talent in so many different areas. You probably could have done a lot of things. And it is interesting how life just shoved you down this path and you've embraced it. And you could not be doing what you are without that past, like you said.
Yeah.
The
You
soil.
can't. Oh, yeah. I was going to say, you can't understand the state of something, what's in front of you, unless you know where it came from. Where it came from and its trajectory is as much a part of it than what it is right in front of you right now.
Yeah. Now, you've teased us a little bit with the other books in the series, and I know readers just love to delve into stories and be able to consume them as much as possible. Can you tell us just a little bit more about the series and what people can expect next?
Sure. So first of all, and God bless every single author who has a long latency between consecutive volumes. But as somebody who is a voracious follower of lots of series, let me tell you, I don't like to wait. So I sort of have the first three books of this series pretty well preloaded. So like the second book is in a pretty late stage of development and will probably release in the middle of next year, like August-ish. And the third book is drafted in its entirety, although like it needs some work. So like, it's probably, it's twice as long as it's probably going to be in the end. But the first book really explores the dynamics of politics and power play and backstabbing within one Menhir, within one institution, where our three gentle, unassuming ascendants, toddle in and are abruptly met with some dark forces that don't have the best interest of our sweet little ascendants at heart, it turns out in the end. But that turns out to be just one tier of the conflict, because nothing attracts the interest of the other Menhirs more swiftly than seeing one of their peers stumble. And then by the end of book one, you have a stumble, and that acquires great interests from the other Menhirs, who are swiftly just descending upon the first to make sure it's okay. And so the second book is exploring that sort of inter-Menhir dynamic, and our points of view. Our characters are swept into that, and they don't realize how good they had it in the first book. So like, God bless them. I mean, at the end of the second book, you're like, these poor characters. I promise you, it's not a snuff film. These characters are these characters have a future. It's a good one. I promise you, I'm not going to betray your time and your hours as a reader. I will deliver. I swear to God. I swear. However, first I have to make things bad, but it's a fun ride down, and it will be filled with laughs as well as as gasps.
Well, you're laughing as you say this, so it's you're talking about, oh yes, and then this is going to happen. Ha 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 ha.
I'm like, yeah. I mean, I do. I love bad guys. I love as long as it's fun. In fact, someone recently said that they likened my dark fantasy to a gray fantasy. I like all of the darkness. I like all of the sort of like macabre, like evil laughter, Maleficent, Ursula sort of elements of bad guys. But I have restraint, right? Like I'm not going to let you get invested in these characters and then do something horrible to them unless it is a very important part of their story and you feel good and just about it by the end of the affair. So because like when I lose a character I love in a series, there is heartbreak, and worse, it's heartbreak where people next to you, oftentimes sitting next to you in bed or across the room or whatever with their earplugs in, they don't really understand why you're so sad. So like I will engage in soft heartbreak, and I will engage in and great evils with my characters, but always with a wink at you. Always with a bit of playfulness.
Oh, I love that, because you're right. There's nothing worse than having your best friend die on the pages before you, and nobody on the train understands. Right?
Yeah. And worse, they're like, this is a fictitious character. And they're like, well, not to me, buddy. And another thing, just look. Yeah. So I just gotta bottle that up, and then just like sobbing for no reason. Like, why am I sobbing? This is a fictitious character. Oh well, Case of us.
Jonathan Pruitt, tell us where people can go to find you online, your website, social media. How can we stalk you?
Jonathan Pruitt, author, on Instagram, and theshadowsofthemonolith.com. And that has supplementary information about the world and about like how the various factions view one another, and quick little witticisms, and some of them might be a little catty, and supplementary information about the history, the Menhirs, the symbology of the various factions. And so if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of the world, I've got that there, and I think you have stuff that you can sink your teeth into. I also have a blog that I keep up to date. So if you're interested in a play-by-play of like who's auditioning for the audiobook, or like how that's going, or like what kind of hike I did this weekend, I will give you lots of that content to try to make you as part of as much of a part of the process as you could reasonably be, and more. I will share it all with you.
Awesome, Jonathan and Pruitt. Thank you so much for joining us on the Books That Make You show.
Oh, thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone for listening.
Absolutely. And you can find out more about us on our website. It's booksthatmakeyou.com. We are on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and of course, we are on YouTube. Make sure you ring the bell, subscribe, throw some comments down below. All of that really helps the channel grow, and we appreciate that so much. And don't forget to subscribe to our Webby Award-winning Books That Make You newsletter so that you never miss out on interviews with fabulous authors like Jonathan. Until next time, all of my bookish buddies, please enjoy all of the books that make you exactly who you are.
The host and executive producer of the Books That Make You show is Desiree Duffy. Sound mastering and engineering by Dave Napox. Social media and content promotion by Siddhi Jahagirdar. Copywriting and editing by Mike Robinson. The Books That Make You show is an award-winning podcast produced by Black Chateau Enterprises.